So I'm not exactly sure why the last video cut off, but I will in this video kind of finish up some of the application problems dealing with ratios and proportions. So in the last problem we looked at the ratio for all the students taking geometry, and we used the ratio of guys to girls, and that worked. In this second problem it says if the ratio is the same for the entire school, and we know that there are 550 students, that's an important number, in the school, how many girls are in the school? Now, we know that the ratio of girls to boys is 5 to 6. We talked about that in the last video. Now, what this 550 students, what does that correspond, or what does that match with in this ratio? Okay, it's not the number of girls, and it's not the number of boys. Okay, it's the total number of students. Okay, and in this ratio, it would correspond with the total number of students in the ratio. So it would correspond with 11, which is 5 plus 6. Okay, so as I write my proportion, the ratio that I'm using is girls, that's what I'm interested to know, girls over total is the ratio I'm using. Okay, so the number of girls in this class up here is 5, and the total number of students in the ratio is 11, and that'll be equal to what I want to know, which is the number of girls in the school, divided by the total number of students, which is 550. So this is the proportion we need to solve. Okay, now in my mind, setting up the proportion is the most difficult part. Once you have the proportion, you can cross multiply and divide and solve pretty easily. So let's cross multiply. 5 times 550 is 2750 is equal to 11x. Divide both sides by 11, and x is equal to 250 girls. Okay, now let's move on to a very different context, but a very related question. Okay, the question is, if the measure of two complementary angles, now keep in mind that complementary angles are two angles that add together to be 90 degrees. Okay, and they're in the ratio of 2 to 7. What are the measures of the angles? Now, think about this ratio and how the 90 degrees relates with that ratio. Now, the 90 doesn't match or correspond with the 2, and it doesn't correspond with the 7 either, because 90 is not the smaller or the larger angle, it's the sum of the two angles. So what it corresponds with is actually 9, which is 2 plus 7. So the ratio I'll look at, now it doesn't ask for, the small one or the big one, it asks for both of them. So I can start with either one I want. I will start with the small one, so I will look at the ratio of small to total. Okay, the small one in this ratio is 2, and the total in this ratio is 9. And that equals the small one of these two angles, which I'll just call x for now, over the total. Now the total would be, when they're added together, is 90 because they're complementary. And I'll solve this proportion by cross multiplying. 2 times 90 is 180, and x times 9 is 9x. Divide both sides by 9. X is equal to 20. So the smaller angle is 20 degrees. Now, to find the larger angle, you could set up another proportion, which is 7 over 9 is equal to y over 90. But since I know they're complementary and the smaller angle is 20, I could simply subtract from 90 and get 70 degrees. Okay, so the two angles are 70 degrees and 20 degrees. Okay, now again a very similar question, but a different context. The lengths of the sides of a triangle are in the extended ratio 3 to 5 to 6. The perimeter of the triangle is 98 inches. Okay, that's an important number. What is the length of the longest side? Okay, let me back up quickly and say that this is an extended ratio, meaning it has more than two numbers in it in a ratio. Okay, and that's more of an exposure idea than a mastery idea. But let's still look at this question. The perimeter we know is 98 inches. Now, what does that correspond with or match with in this ratio? Well, a perimeter is what you get when you add up all the sides. So that corresponds with when I add up these numbers. Okay, so it corresponds with 14. And the question I'm being asked is about the longest side. Okay, now the longest side in this ratio is going to be 6. So I'll look at longest over total is the ratio I'm looking at. So in this ratio, the longest is 6, the total is 14. And it's equal to the longest side in the triangle, which I don't know, I'll call it x, over the total, which will be the perimeter of 98. So let me cross multiply. 6 times 98 is 588 is equal to 14 times x, which is 14x. Divide both sides by 14. And x is equal to 42 inches. Okay, so the longest side is 42 inches. Okay, I'm hoping that makes sense. Now, let me just warn you, the fact that the last 3 problems I did, I always used the total. Okay, now don't take that as that's what you're always going to do. You need to look at the situation, see the numbers that you have, and which ratio would match up what you know and what you want to know. Okay, but frequently we will use the total, but not always, so be careful about that. Okay, so solving proportions, I'm going to skip number 1. We've done several like this. Number 2, although it's in my mind it's very similar, a lot of this 9 right here kind of throws off a lot of students. So let's do number 2 real quick. 9 times 70 is 630, and 10 times 9x is 90x. You simply divide both sides by 90, and x is equal to 7. Okay, now even though the 9 was there, it's no different than before. Now number 3 is where it starts to get interesting. Okay, now questions 1 and 2 are more mastery level questions. By the end of this unit, you should master those questions. Okay, 3 and 4 are more exposure type questions that you should be able to do if you're planning on taking Algebra 2 next year. So we will do the same idea by cross multiplying. 2 times 56 is 112. And 7 times b plus 1 is, now I'm going to take a step and say it's 7 times b plus 1. Okay, I'll take it in 2 steps to make sure you don't make the mistake. Okay, I will then distribute the 7. So I get 112 is equal to 7b plus 7. Okay, now if you want to skip the first step and say, well, 7 times b plus 1 is 7 times b and 7 times 1, that's fine. But be careful because students frequently miss the second digit, and it's 7 times both of them. So keep that in mind. So to solve this, I will subtract 7 from both sides. And 105 is equal to 7b. I will divide both sides by 7, and b is equal to 15. Okay, the last problem, number 4, which I think is the most difficult one on this page, because the 2 plus 1 right here, and because we have x's in 2 places. But we still use the same method. We cross multiply. X times 40, excuse me, is 40x, and 16 times 2x plus 1 is 16 times 2x plus 1. Again, to be very careful with when they have more than one term in there. 16 times 2x is 32x. 16 times 1 is plus 16. I will then subtract 32x from both sides to get the x's together, and 8x is equal to 16. So I divide both sides by 8, and x is equal to 2. Okay, now that wraps up the idea about solving proportions. There's one more idea that shows up in the got it questions and some of the practice problems that I wanted to hit before we wrap up this video. Okay, and it deals with some properties of proportions that come in handy if you're simplifying or solving proportions. Okay, one property is called the reciprocal property. Okay, now we've already talked about this year that reciprocal means flipping something over. Okay, and I hope it makes sense. And if I take this proportion up here that's boxed, and if I flip over both fractions, I get 3 over x, and that would be equal to 7 over y. And that's because you're flipping both ratios over. Okay, the switch property, which I don't think that's the true mathematical term, but that's kind of what our book calls it, so we'll call it the switch property, is where you're allowed to take two digits, digits that are diagonal of each other, so 3 and y or x and 7, and interchange them. So x over y is equal to 3 over 7. Okay, and that's kind of because we're switching up the kind of ratio we're looking at, but things that are corresponding are still corresponding. So instead of looking this way in a proportion, we are now looking this way in a proportion. Okay, so 7 over y would be equal to 3 over 7. I hope that kind of makes sense, that you're looking horizontally in the proportion instead of vertically. So if x matches with y and 3 matches with 7. Okay. Oops. Okay, let's move on to the last property, which I call the add or subtract 1 property. And I'll do a little more explaining with this one because I think it takes some explaining. So if I take 3 over x, and I add, let me back up, x over 3, and I add 1 to both sides of the equation. Okay, I'm using the addition property of equality, and these two sides of the equation will stay equal. Now, the trick comes as I change the number 1, so I match the denominator. Okay, I'm going to rewrite 1 as 3 over 3. And I'll rewrite this one as 7 over 7. Okay, I'm still adding 1 to both sides of the equation, but now I have a common denominator, and I can combine them together. X plus 3 over 3 is equal to y plus 7 over 7. Okay, and this is the property. Now, generally, we'll just kind of keep in mind the fact that you can take the proportion and add the denominator to the numerator. Okay, and the reason that works is because you're simply adding 1 to both sides of the equation. Okay, now in the got it question, it deals with subtraction, but the same property applies, and now instead of adding 1, you're subtracting 1. And so based on the got it question, is you can do minus 3 and minus 7, and that still works. Okay, now that wraps up our discussion about ratios and proportions, and I hope this video was helpful to you.